Hey everyone, Kristen from Media Better One and Knits here today to talk to you about a potentially controversial subject, and that is wool. I recently posted a reel on my Instagram.
That's a real quick no. That's a hard pass. Absolutely not. Very uninterested in that option.
About finding non-itchy wools and ways to do that. And somebody commented that wool is cruel. So I wanted to delve into that a little bit today, with the caveat that if you are a vegan or somebody coming from the perspective that using any animal-derived products is cruel, this video is not for you, because we are approaching this from two different perspectives. This video is primarily for knitters or other fiber artists who are perhaps wondering about using wool yarn. So I am not speaking to wool production for mass manufacturers, which is a related but separate issue. So with that said, there is nothing inherently cruel about wool. And by that I mean that shearing sheep, while it might be uncomfortable for them, it is not, when done correctly, painful or injurious in any way. It is a haircut. So that's why I say inherently. There's a whole mess of other stuff we're going to get into, but inherently, the giving a sheep a haircut is not cruel. And in fact, domesticated sheep need to be sheared. They produce so much wool that not shearing them can be hazardous to their health. So that's sort of the baseline that I'm going to work from, because there are a lot of things to consider from there. But a sheep being shorn by someone who knows what they're doing is not being injured and is actually going to benefit. That said, the reason for this is because domesticated sheep have been selected to produce so much wool. Sheep living in the wild, not that there are very many these days, but they do not need to be shorn because they produce the correct amount as needed for their bodies. But domesticated sheep do need to be shorn. So then we get into the issue of, well, why do we have to continue to have domesticated sheep? Historians and archaeologists estimate that sheep have been domesticated for upwards of 10,000 years. So this is not recent, and undoing 10,000 years worth of sheep domestication is not a simple process. And while the process is different these days, sheep have been selected for wool production for, some estimates say, about 6,000 years. So even if we were to take all of the domestic sheep in the world and release them into the wild today, this does not solve the problem that they are overproducing wool and will continue to overproduce wool and need to be shorn. And that will continue to go on as they reproduce until they were to naturally evolve back to producing less wool, depending on what climate they were in. So it's not as simple as saying, okay, let's just not have domesticated sheep anymore. It doesn't work like that. So that means that sheep are in the same situation as a lot of domesticated animals, in that they are, many cases, are living on what are essentially factory farms. And yes, the conditions there can be bad. And yes, the process of shearing there may be being done by people who don't know what they're doing or are working too fast to care if they're hurting animals. So just like with any other domesticated animal that is producing something, whether it's meat or milk or wool, for mass consumption, there are going to be concerns about animal cruelty. And that is definitely something that we should be concerned about. How do you know? How can you know about the welfare of the sheep that your wool is coming from? In many cases, you can't know, and that's particularly the case with wool production for these mass manufacturers, garment companies. It's a little bit easier if you are a knitter or a crocheter and you are looking to buy ethical wool, because wool yarn is produced by a variety of manufacturers, a lot of which are still small, and where you can still get that information from them. So as with anything, as a consumer, you should be an educated consumer, and you need to make the effort to find out where your wool is coming from. Make the effort to purchase from producers who are committed to animal welfare. Make the effort to purchase from the sort of more recently developing yarn producers who are doing small batch traceable yarns, where you can follow along basically from the sheep to the skein and see what is happening and where it comes from, and you can see and learn about the whole process. So if animal welfare is something that concerns you, you have the responsibility, I think, to be an educated consumer and to make the effort to find out where your wool is coming from. There are some big name, sort of larger yarn producers that maybe that information isn't available. So then you might need to take a step back and say, well, until I have more information, I'm not going to use such and such brand or yarn producer. There are also some larger producers who are still able to give you that information, and that you can go in and find out about the farmers and about, you know, the source countries and about the welfare standards and things like that. So one that comes to mind is Knitpicks. I know that we think of that as a very sort of kind of big box, but they have recently been providing a lot more of that information about where the yarn is coming from. So we're seeing, even with larger producers, a bit of a trend toward traceability so that you can find out where your wool is from and make an educated decision when you are buying your wool. Something that comes up a lot with regard to wool is a process that I may not be pronouncing correctly, but I'm going to put it on the screen here. And as I've never heard anybody say this aloud, I'm going to say mulesing. This takes place primarily in Australia, which is one of the world's largest wool producers. And it is a process of removing skin from the backside of sheep to prevent something called fly strike. There's a certain kind of blowfly that, as I understand it, is from Australia, so that's why you're not seeing this in other wool producing areas, that will lay its eggs in the folds of the sheep's skin. And I guess sheep are most prone to have these kind of folds and wrinkles in their skin around their backside. So the skin is removed, and once it scars over, it will no longer grow fleece. So there's less of a concern about this fly strike. And this is done generally without anesthetic. It sounds horrible. Fly strike also sounds horrible. And there has been a big push to get away from that. So if, again, animal cruelty, animal welfare is something you're concerned about, you'll want to know if wherever you're getting your wool or yarn from is a breeder or a producer that uses this technique. They're developing alternatives. Again, as I understand it, this is primarily of concern in Australia because that's where this fly lives, and it is not a concern in other places. So that may be something that you want to be educated about. It is a terrible process. It certainly would fall under the definition of cruelty to perform this, what they call surgery, with no anesthetic. But it is not done everywhere. And there is a big push away from it, which is good, and it is largely due to consumer backlash. So another consideration when we're discussing cruelty and whether wool is cruel or cruelty-free. There's also sort of an inherent connection between the wool industry and the meat industry in that many of the animals are produced for both, or many of the animals are produced for wool but then may be slaughtered for meat when the wool production value drops off. So if you are a vegetarian or concerned about, sort of animal welfare in the meat production industries, then you may have to sort of look beyond the wool aspect and look into the what happens to your sheep after they stop producing wool. The last thing that I kind of want to address, though, is that I don't necessarily think that there is anything such as cruelty-free. Because, yay, capitalism, the production of almost everything is rife with cruelty to someone or something, whether it's animals, whether it's humans, or whether it's the environment. So maybe perhaps you're saying, well, I will use cotton. Cotton doesn't come from animals. No, but actually millions of animals are killed in the cotton harvesting process because it is done by large machines that just plow through the fields to harvest cotton and kill animals along the way. And that's true for pretty much any large-scale agricultural farming. The harvesting, where possible, is done by these large machines that kill countless animals in the process. Where it's not true and things, crops are perhaps still picked by hand, like your strawberries from California, that laborer industry is rife with cruelty to human beings who are exploited and made to labor for 8, 10, 12 hours a day under the sun, in the heat, no breaks, little water, and then are paid garbage for it. Or, so maybe you were, I will use acrylic yarn. That doesn't come from sheep. No, but it's really awful for the environment. Not only the production of it, but the fact that it doesn't biodegrade. So really, the point I want to make here is that when we think about cruelty-free, it's mostly a system of trade-offs, where something is maybe better for the environment but worse for the humans, or it's better for the humans but it's worse for the animals, but it's better for the animals but it's worse for the environment. And unfortunately, that is the way our society is structured. That is the way capitalism is structured. And there is no easy way around that. So going back to the very beginning where I mentioned that vegans come from a position where we shouldn't be using animal products of any kind. And I decided to be a vegetarian when I was 17 years old because when I was young, I was also idealistic and thought I was going to change the world. And what I have learned in the 20 plus years since then is just that the world doesn't work that way. It's not black and white. Capitalism is not structured in a way that allows consumers to have enough information to choose products that are cruelty-free. And even if we did have enough information, everything is so linked together, all of the industries, all of the businesses, that somewhere along the way, someone or something is being hurt or exploited. I'm not meaning this to be a bummer of a video. So ultimately, I think the best we can hope for is making the least poor choice based on our personal values and pushing for improvements where we can. So for me, personally, that means that I am okay with using wool. I do my best to educate myself to make sure it is coming from companies that I believe are abiding animal welfare standards and environmental standards and paying their workers fair wages and producing ethically and sustainably insofar as they can. And for everybody else, I think that you also have to make the same decision based on your personal values. So that is pretty much the summary of what I wanted to say about wool. And the biggest takeaway I can give you is that there is nothing inherently cruel about shearing sheep, but like every other industry in the world, there are pros and cons. There are things that you should know about in order to make your decision and need to educate yourself about. And we as consumers should always be pushing for better, but not let perfection stand in the way of good.